So thank you everybody for joining me. I am delighted to be joined by David Alesworth, who just wrapped up a pretty exciting solo exhibition at Canvas Gallery. And over the past decade, his work has been organized around an expanded vision of the garden as global forest, of which we are all a part. The garden is his key metaphor with which to question humanity's culturally specific relationships with the natural world and to better understand the notion of nature as a social problem. His own hybrid identity as a Pakistani national of white British ethnicity informs many aspects of his practice. David Alesworth, born in 1957 in the UK, is a sculptor, a photographer, and a researcher of garden histories, working between Pakistan and the United Kingdom. He is the former head of sculpture at the Indus Valley School of Visual Arts and Design from 1991 to 2002, and a professor at BNU in Lahore from 2006 to 2015. He is a member of the Royal Society of British Sculptors and a Stanley Picker Fellowship Award holder. In 2016, he was shortlisted for the V&A Jameel Prize. Alesworth is a studio holder at Spike Island. Alesworth's recent exhibitions include The Glory of the Garden, which took place in December 2018, Lie of the Land, and the inaugural show at the MK Gallery, Milton Keynes, in February 2019. And of course, the Carless Mapping, which is a solo show that just closed up at Canvas, which I'm very excited to chat to him about as well. David, thank you so much for joining us today. It's really a pleasure. And I thought we could jump right into it. I wanted to ask you if you could briefly sum up maybe your journey through art and how your interest in exploring gardens in particular came about.
Okay, so I'm thinking of my journey to becoming an artist as a series of stepping stones, and tonight those are a young teacher at my boarding school, my public school, St. John's, Leatherhead, who shared his thesis project with us. I think he was at the Royal College, and it consisted of a light organ, and this was pre-Pink Floyd and all of that. And he had built this amazing contraption, and he was playing it at the Lord's Cricket Ground, and this left a deep impression on me. And then, going to Brooklands Technical College and doing my A-levels, this would be in the 70s, in the mid-70s. And I was there with two people who became artists, my contemporaries, Simon Bill and Robert Wells. And there was a new liberal arts department set up there at that time. And there were these two fresh, again, Royal College graduates who just come out. That was Colin Drysdale and John Honey. And much to the detriment of our A-levels, we just kind of plunged into what was more or less a kind of a foundation year. But the other great thing about that place was it had this 40-acre nature reserve that was filled with tree rhododendrons. So it was really paradisical. And I think, for much of my life, if I thought of dying and going to paradise, it would be going back to those years at Brooklyn. And of course, the Brooklands racetrack, what was left of it was there too. And then sort of going on, I did my foundation year at Epsom. We were more or less left to get on with our own inquiries, Simon Bill and myself. And I went on to Wimbledon, and I studied under Glyn Williams and Lee Grandjean in particular. And at that time, Peter Fuller was the kind of philosophical lead for that particular department. He subsequently died in, I think, 1990 in a road crash. And there was a lot of machismo on that course. And I think in many ways, as a teacher, subsequently, one tries to sort of navigate the pitfalls of one's own education as much as anything else. But what was great on that course was there were enormous opportunities to put work out into the public sphere, and I think that's such an important thing for an art student to do, to kind of step out of the boundaries and the ivory tower of the art school.
It's very important.
Yeah, it doesn't happen very easily because it's not an easy thing to integrate into a curriculum. I did the Picker Fellowship at Kingston University, and I met my first wife there, Duriya Kazi, who
Okay.
ultimately led me to Pakistan. And she
Wow.
was a long-standing collaborator. And from there, I went to Glasgow, and I held the sculpture chair there for 2 years, and did some teaching. And then, what was really transformative was that in 2007 to 2010, I undertook the Trans-Art program in Berlin, and that's a low residency summer program. And that was really fantastic. That was the point where I willfully collapsed my gardening career, if you like, into my art practice.
Oh, so
And
prior to that, they were still quite separate in a sense, in your
yeah, I
mind
mean,
anyway.
yeah, for some reason,
Interesting. Yeah.
to that point, I more or less held them apart. I looked at them as,
Okay.
there were plenty of crossovers, but it was really that late MFA that caused me to look for a path to integrate those two aspects,
I
those
find
two
that quite
paradigms.
interesting because often, when you finished college and whatever discipline you're studying, people tend to delve or dive right into a master's. And I think it's so important to take off time and work on your own, regardless of whether you're an artist or a political scientist or a writer, whatever it is. It's important to kind of explore things on your own because when you go back then, you can then move your practice or your research interest in so many different directions like you did and end up finding a new love of something that you perhaps hadn't even really properly considered unifying and exploring.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I think if you're going to sustain, a lifetime of practice as an artist, you need to be engaged with something that's very broad, bigger than yourself, whether it's history or science or, or the study of gardens come to that. Um, but at Berlin, there were tremendous people. We had these really intense sessions. Klaus Noll, who sadly died subsequently, ran that program with his partner Cello, who's still running it. And I worked with people like Leon Johnson, Mary King, Aaron Levy, Carolyn Gerton, John John Marie Kasparian, and so many of the alumni who are my peers and my friends to this day.
And tell me, what was it about that master's program? What was the aha moment, perhaps, where you thought, oh, actually, I'd like to combine my gardening into my art and take it in this new direction?
Yeah, it's
Was
a
it,
it's a hard
did you have
one.
an aha moment? Yeah.
I'm not sure I did, but I mean, I think Leon Johnson was somebody who was looking at food and food culture as art practice,
Okay.
and I think that was quite expanding for me. And we had these crazily intense sessions where we'd have sort of 12-hour sessions and be making art and reading theory and debating and a really incredible time. I can't recommend it highly enough. And the second part of the question is, where do the gardens come from in my life? And my interest in the natural world. I think it was, it's my Irish mother and the culture of the family, very strongly there. But also growing up at a huge garden in Oxshott in Surrey, and all of us as children and young adults had to work in that garden. It was, I think, something like 2.25 acres, and we were all very reluctant to work in it. But we've all sort of engaged with the garden in our lives subsequently in
It's
various ways.
very satisfying, isn't it? And it gives you a great, I mean, I do not garden, but I do know that it's something I would like to try doing because from what I understand, it's very calming to be around plants and nature. I'm not, whenever I've tried to keep a little plant, they always end up dying, so that's separate. But especially during this time when people have been forced to stay at home, I think many of them have taken up gardening. Many of my friends have taken up
Yeah,
gardening or buying little
yeah,
plants, keeping them at
yeah,
home.
yeah.
And it's pretty interesting how
Mm. I
being
like
around
that.
nature to that extent changes things.
Yeah, I mean, I think the mental health benefits are huge, and that's just being explored now. Um, and the gardening is perhaps the oldest profession.
Hmm. And is it true that I remember reading this briefly that your grandfather was also a horticulturist and
Yeah,
that there is
yeah,
a plant that has been named after him,
yeah. No,
or
that's
he
great. It was
named it
like
himself?
great. Yeah, it's great you raised that. He didn't name it himself. In fact, I had
Oh,
it here in
okay.
front of me. And my mother always said it's a particularly hideous shade of red, unfortunately.
Oh,
Um, but uh, but Herbert Robinson bred it and named it after him. He was Frederick Wilberforce Aylesworth.
okay.
And it's a hybrid tea, and it was bred in 1951. And I barely knew my grandfather. But as a 5 or 6 year old, he taught me my first botanical name, which was Acer palmatum dissectum autoperforeum. And this he applied to this little purple bush with serrated leaves in my parents' rose garden. And I can remember as a child thinking, you know, uh, that's fascinating and ridiculous at the
And
same
that's
time.
quite a
And
mouthful. I'm surprised that as a little child you were able to pronounce it and let alone remember it until today. Well
yeah,
done.
wow, I'm big now.
But how
But yes,
lovely.
yeah, and I think I didn't learn another Latinate name for probably 15 years subsequently.
So that
But
was the
what's
only one
really,
that you used as a reference.
yeah, but what's really interesting is I didn't really know him. He died when I was very young, and subsequently I meet him on the internet more and more because as one Googles oneself, multiple times in a day, I bump into my grandfather. Because more and more books are being digitized, and he wrote the foreword of
Of
various
course.
things. He was the chairman of different dianthus societies and things like that. So fascinatingly so, I meet him on
Oh,
the internet.
wonderful. And it's quite special to know that you share such a strong interest with someone who you didn't know at all, but who was very much a part of your life and heritage in that sense.
Yeah, yeah, and I'm sure there's some kind of epigenetic memory at play.
I'm sure.
You know. Hmm.
And tell me a little bit about the move to Pakistan. I mean, you've spoken about how you met Guria, your first wife, and you've collaborated a great deal, and she introduced you to Pakistan. But at the same time, you've stayed, I mean, well, now you're no longer here, but you stayed in Pakistan for about 30 years, and you go so much to identify as a sort of Pakistani citizen. And I'd love to hear your thoughts about how that came about, how you perhaps fell in love with the country or found an affinity to
Yeah.
it in any case.
Yeah, I think in many ways I'm an accidental Pakistani,
Yeah.
um, but very joyfully so. What happened was, I think we came for Daria's brother's wedding. We came for our own wedding in 1982. But while we were there, we were offered a landscape project with Ashish
Okay.
Shahid in Karachi. And they were developing a hospital on the edge of Baluchistan called the Hab Choki Hospital. Or, actually, it wasn't the Hab Choki Hospital. It was in Hab Choki. And
Okay.
we took on that project and we worked on it for, on and off for a number of years. And whilst we were doing that, we took on a huge number of landscape projects in Karachi at all sorts of scales. And then in around 1989, the Inter-Saudi School was established. So, one was getting drawn into more and more things. And there was no question of sort of disentangling oneself and going back to what in particular. It was the Thatcher years in the UK. And in due course, I took on Pakistani nationality. How I managed that quite, I'm not sure. It's not an easy thing for someone like myself to
Really?
do. Well, I think, you know how Pakistan is in terms of every foreigner being a potential spy. And,
Did you ever
but I
face
did,
questions about that, by the way? Were there any special stories that you'd like to recount?
well, I do. The only one I could recount is actually going into Russia at St. Petersburg on a Pakistani passport.
Ah, yes,
and
that must have been quite
basically,
an adventure.
yes, and basically shutting down the sort of immigration queue for a while while they worked out what to do with me, because I think it was shades of the Afghan war sort of still lingering. But the
Of
reason
course.
was that on a British passport from Islamabad, there was something like a 10-week background check, whereas on a Pakistani
Mm,
passport, I got the visa quite quickly.
that's
And
very
then spent quite,
convenient.
but I spent quite a lot of time in the immigration queue in St. Petersburg. But I mean, generally, people are surprised when I put down the green passport, but I carry it with pride.
Good. I'm glad that you do, as do I actually as well.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And tell me about Indus Valley. So you began teaching there fairly early on, and then you moved on to BNU. So you
Yeah,
worked both sort of as an academic and an artist. Was
yeah.
academia something that you thought you would go into at that time, or was it also, I
No,
mean, one thing
not at
led
all.
to another?
Yeah, I think every young art student thinks they're going to be a star, and teaching is not really at the foremost of their mind. But maybe people are more mature today. Um, but that was an amazing experience. I worked with incredible people. I had the most amazing students, um, many of which are my colleagues and friends today. And I taught at Indus for something like 14 years before I went on to be a new and all, and I was there for about 10 years. And
Okay.
yeah, but I mean, the thing with teaching is it's very demanding.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
And you were
and
teaching sculpture, right? Which is even more, or maybe it's not more, I don't know actually.
well, I don't know if it's
But it
more
seems
demanding.
quite,
But,
yeah.
yeah, yeah. I mean, potentially physically it is. I mean, I still
Definitely.
consider myself to be a sculptor, even though,
Hmm.
I largely work with a needle and thread. I think it's a response to the machismo of my undergraduate training. It's an attack on all those assumptions.
Makes sense. While you were
Mm.
teaching at Indus Valley and BNU, were there any, I don't know, were there any students who really stood out to you at that point, or were there students who you went on to,
Enormously so, enormously so. I mean, I think the skill base and even the kind of global
mm,
knowledge of the Pakistani student is incredible. I think there's a kind of overconfidence about your exposure in the West. And I think, the average young Pakistani is a much more of a global citizen, much more aware of the whole world and the issues of the world. And on
I've
top of
also
that,
found that. Yeah.
no, go ahead.
No, I was saying I've also found that, and I actually really admire how artists like yourself and, like, for example, Rashid Rana, Imran Qureshi, Salima Hashmi, Nazir
Yeah.
Shataula, you all, despite your own art practices, you go back and continue to
Mm.
teach at these schools and continue to be mentors for students and help them in
Mm.
their own development. I think it's something quite rare and it's really
Yeah.
admirable. And I've
Yeah.
said this fairly often, but it's really true, and it's amazing because and many of the artists very generously say, well, we learn so much from our students that
Of
we
course.
want to keep doing it
Yeah.
as well. But it
Yeah.
does
Yeah.
obviously take out time
Mm.
from your own practice and your own thought process. So it's brilliant.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think the art education in Pakistan is really well class. And I know that, I look at art education elsewhere. And, in terms of, you were asking about particular students.
Hmm.
Um, well, one comes to mind in particular. I was actually in her studio yesterday. That was Adila Suleiman.
Ah,
And
okay.
she was my student, and we were just talking about issues of teaching and working and so many things. And she was somebody who actually assisted Duria and myself on some of those sort of 90s projects in Karachi,
Yeah.
the big public projects. But also Dr. Adnan Madni, who's
Ah,
teaching at
okay.
Gold,
Yes, yes.
was my student and my colleague and my very good friend, and somebody who subsequently teaches me. just as it should be.
Yes, it's very interesting. I actually wanted to ask you, you spoke about the large-scale public projects that you and Durya did in the 90s. What were the responses to that like at the time when
Mm.
public art installation? I mean, there were no biennales at
Mm.
the time, I don't believe.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
were people very intrigued by what you were doing? Did they respond well to
Mm.
it?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, they responded fantastically well. I mean, you're right. There wasn't funding. There wasn't a kind of international outreach as a framework for those works.
Mm-hmm.
And you know what they say about pioneers. I think Picasso said something like that first you do something, and then somebody comes along and does it pretty. And I think you could say that about a lot of those projects. But, Art Caravan was a kind of precursor to a project like Art Mahal. And I think Art
Mm-hmm.
Mahal in many ways, and that was a broader collaboration with Iftikhar and Elizabeth Dadi and Daria
Okay.
Kazi and myself. And for me, in a way, that's a seminal kind of Karachi pop project and a kind of
Mm-hmm.
celebration of urban crafts particularly in Karachi, but also, for me at least, a celebration of Sufi shrine culture. You know, I feel that there's that aspect to it as well. There's this kind of immersive environment of those 900 hand-painted light bulbs. But going on to the contact with the audience, which Art Caravan did have. Taj Mahal less so, although it did have a kind of a public life to a lesser extent in Karachi. But following
And
on
can you
that, in
just clarify
1997,
a little bit more for those of us who may not know properly what the difference between Art Mahal and Art Caravan was?
Art Caravan was a project that Daria Kazi set up at Karachi School of Art around, I think,
Okay.
94. And basically it involved, and I suppose into this context, I should say that Daria had written her undergraduate dissertation on truck art in Pakistan.
Okay.
And then she did that as a student at Kingston University before, prior to coming back to Pakistan. And her art caravan project came out of a class that she was teaching on contemporary Islamic art.
Okay.
And so in a way, that was the question was, what might contemporary Islamic art look like? And Art Caravan was the answer. And Art Caravan was a Bedford truck that the students all worked upon and then accompanied it as it drove around Pakistan. And I think Shell were one of the sponsors, and it went around all the Shell pumps right up to the Shell.
How
I'd
fantastic.
I'd say all of them, probably not all of them. And there were many sort of aspects of the project. It was a messy project, but a fantastic project. And and if anything, and the Dadis were partially involved in that as well, because
All
we
right.
all looked after it to some extent while Daria was on a US sponsored tour for a while. So we looked
Okay.
after her class. And I think we all came out of it with enormous respect for truck art,
Mm-hmm.
the sophistication of it.
It's so memorable and clever as well when you often see those trucks go. I mean, you probably know this far better than I do after having done an entire project on it, but the poetry at the back, the imagery, the very recognizable vividness of the paint as well. It's really quite a beautiful way of spreading art around the
Yeah,
country.
yeah, yeah. I mean, there's all kinds of conventions to it, and also there's
Yeah.
often a truck designer who kind of orchestrates all aspects of it.
Oh, okay. What was so now you're in the UK, very sort of in a sense geographically removed from Pakistan. You're in Bristol, I understand. How has that been? I mean, are you missing your time in Lahore and Karachi quite significantly? Has your work changed as a result of your being there at all, or thought processes perhaps? Because sometimes when you're, at least I find this when I'm away from Pakistan, my outlook towards it and perhaps outlook of myself also develops in different directions. rather than when you're within the country, immersed by the sound and the hustle and bustle of everything around you. Sometimes separation can be a bit helpful. Have you found that, or?
Yeah, I mean, I would say sort of, as an immediate response to being here now, when we came to Karachi, I came in on the 19th of November to prepare for my show. And I think there was a period of about 10 days where I had new eyes to look at Pakistan with. And it was tremendously exciting. And at this point, some weeks later, it's still tremendously exciting, but you start to see all the other things as well, and it gets more complex. And and I think to come in with those new eyes, in the same way, I think in 2015 when we moved to the UK, we had new eyes for the UK.
Yes.
And that's great. And as an artist, I hope that I can travel between the two countries, and I really want to do projects between the two countries. What form that will take, I'm not sure at the moment. But
Well, it's nice
that's one
to
of the
be open. Yeah. What prompted the move? Was it anything in particular, or?
Yes, I mean, our daughter and myself both have dual nationalities,
Okay.
and Huma Moji, my wife, does not. So that was one of the motivations, and they just
Okay.
raised the residency period to 5 years, and we saw
Okay.
it going to 2 years. It's getting increasingly difficult to move around the world with only a green passport. But that said, we've taken that on at a point where the red passport is turning blue again or black,
I know.
um,
It's having
and
its
we're
own
being
problems right now.
yeah, we're being diminished. My European identity is being stripped away, which I'm very sad about.
And in Bristol, you mentioned that you were teaching there as well. Can you tell me a little bit about where you're working, perhaps, and what
Yeah,
you're
yeah.
teaching?
Yeah. As in terms of teaching in Bristol, I've done some mentoring, but also I've
Okay.
been a visiting lecturer at different universities and art departments. And, that's not a huge part of my life. I mean, that's something that comes up from time to time. And budgets are not fantastic in the UK for these things at the moment, which is very sad. Um, but what has been a big part of my life in the UK is being a hands-on gardener. And in Pakistan, there is a whole section of society that has always known me as a Gora Mali.
Hmm.
And, I need a T-shirt with that on it. But I'm very much the
You can make an
Gora Mali.
artwork that says it.
Yeah, yeah. I'm very much the Gora Mali in the Gora land. And that's fantastic, and I really enjoy it. And I'm not doing complex landscape design projects. I'm actually working as a gardener some days of the week, and that saves me from the studio. And I think everyone needs saving from the studio sometimes. I think, I in particular need my hands and feet in the soil. It's partially research. And it's very much research actually, but it's also a
And
kind of
downtime.
counterbalance to and it's a counterbalance to the kind of ivory tower of the studio. And I think, artists need that other identity. It's been fantastic. I really enjoy it.
And is there, and please forgive my ignorance in this question, but is there a particular plant that you have really enjoyed sort of nurturing and seeing it as it grows and grows larger and
Mm.
larger, or
I mean, that's an interesting question. There's so many,
is
actually.
really?
But, I mean, a plant I really enjoy in the UK is the tree peony. And that was a leaf that William Morris sort of referred to again and again in his botanical designs. And it's a plant I really love. But I mean, I really love herbaceous perennials, which you can only grow in the north of Pakistan. And I've been lucky enough as a kind of landscape professional to work from the Indian Ocean right up to, the Chinese border in Baltistan. And
Oh, wow,
there's so
okay.
many diverse, microclimates and environments and soil types. And, Pakistan is just such an amazing country. And I've been lucky enough to kind of encounter so many aspects of it through my landscape practice.
And has your well, I'm guessing that very different plants take root in Pakistan and in the UK, obviously because of different soil climates, etc.
Yeah,
Is there
yeah.
something that you've enjoyed working with that you haven't been able to work with in Pakistan?
Yeah, particularly the herbaceous perennials. I mean,
Oh,
that's something.
particularly that one.
Yeah, and the
And
herbaceous
that
perennials.
doesn't take root in Pakistan at all.
No, I mean, you can grow some of these
Mm.
plants in the north in certain soil types, but in Karachi, not really. But I
Mm.
mean, what's magical about them is that they die in the winter. They appear to disappear, and they come back in the spring. And so this kind of this cycle of the seasons is a fantastic thing. And I think that, that's something that's directly feeding into the work that I'm doing at the moment.
And tell me about that work finally. I know we've been talking quite a lot about sort of past work and your gardening, but I also wanted to ask you, A, about the show that you just wrapped up and how
Yeah.
your practice has really, in a sense, not come to fruition because you've obviously been exhibiting for a very long time, and this was not by any
Mm.
means sort of mid-career retrospective or anything, but I was just wondering, is it your first show after having left Pakistan to do again in the country, or?
No, it's not actually. And there,
Mm,
there are aspects of the show which are very much in response to the show that I did in
mm.
2018, and that was at
Ah, okay.
Koil Gallery in Karachi, and that show was called The Glory of the Garden. And
Mm,
looking at the Rudyard Kipling's poem, The Glory of the Garden. And in that show, there was a lot of work that spoke about re-encountering aspects of the natural world in the UK alongside
mm,
the kind of more colonially reflective works of the carpet interventions
mm-hmm.
and some work along the kind of gardening of the archive series to do with research in the Kew Garden archives that refer to Lawrence Gardens in Lahore. And what I did there was I worked hard to put the show up. I gave a talk, and then I jumped on a plane the next day and went back to the UK.
Oh,
And
wow.
thereafter, I felt sort of bereft for, months of just being so dislocated so quickly from that body of work.
Mm,
And so with the show I've just done at Canvas, I made a commitment to spend 6 hours a day with the work and with the audience. And so what has happened with the kind of COVID precautions that everyone is respecting is I had small numbers of people come in throughout the day. And I spoke to everyone at length. And that was really energizing, really fantastic. So I did, sort of 60 hours of work just doing that over the 10 days or so of the show.
oh,
And
wonderful.
with that huge Carlos mapping, with a Karachi audience. I mean, basically that mapping is Karachi 200 years ago through colonial eyes. And so everyone had this enormous connection to that work and,
It's a
speculative.
magnificent piece. It's huge.
Yeah, it's huge. I mean, why I make these huge carpets, I don't know. I do know, but I can't get out of it. I mean, I know why I do it because I grew up with a huge Kashan carpet and I played on it as a child.
Mm,
And some of my earliest memories are of sitting on flowers, which were about the scale of myself. And
mm,
I was aware of the medallion at its center, and I was also aware of the walls of paradise. But I didn't know, I didn't have further readings of it at that time. So that particular work really resonated with a Karachi audience, and so much came out of that. It was really fantastic. However, the show is now down, and I am bone tired. I feel like the marrow has been drained from my bones. I'm in a
but do
sort of
you feel
recovery
very
period.
fulfilled?
Yeah, I
Did you
feel
feel
fulfilled,
quite
but
fulfilled after? Yeah.
I do, but I feel quiet. I feel quiet inside. I feel like I'm
But
in a.
that sounds like a good state to be in, to be quiet and fulfilled and
Hmm,
just feel that what you've been working on for such a long time is there
yeah,
and you've been
yeah.
able to really give the work the due it deserved as well. Were you surprised by any of the reactions? You mentioned that the
Yeah,
people who came really connected with that one particular piece, but were there other
yeah.
pieces that also spoke to them?
Yeah. I think the show as a whole, it was very tightly curated. There wasn't a lot of
Mm,
work. There were very distinct series of 3 or 4 series of work, and it just worked really well. I felt good about it, and that doesn't always happen with shows, no matter
yeah,
how
you don't always feel
good
good.
your
That's true.
intentions are. Yeah, well,
Yeah.
not to that extent. But yeah, it was great. And you were asking if this is what I expected, and of course it wasn't, because I'm looking at this COVID moment. I'm really thinking that I have a studio in Lahore, and I produce work there as well, in a very limited way. And I looked at this as a possibility of getting that work down to the gallery and putting it in their hands, rather than it sitting there for another 3 years, but before the
Hmm.
next slot comes up. So I wasn't expecting anything out of this at this moment because of the whole situation.
Yeah.
But it's been really great. It's been really great.
I'm happy to hear that. And I'd imagine that as long as, well, if everyone's being careful, if the opening times are staggered, if people are wearing
Mm.
masks, going
Yeah,
in
yeah,
and ones and twos and
yeah.
keeping appropriate distances, then it is a nice outing and it's very refreshing to go and see an art exhibition
Mm.
in the middle of a very strange pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, I think for many people, it's a way of connecting to their normal lives. And I think
Mm.
everyone's been very cautious about, for instance, with the opening, we extended it from 11 in the morning till 8 p.m. at night or
Good,
thereabouts.
yeah.
So, you know, um, but it also meant that you were talking to people from 11 in the morning till 8
I
p.m.
know it's
at night.
exhausting.
But it's
Very,
great,
very tiring.
And I think
Especially
that.
after this year of not
Yeah.
talking to anybody, suddenly when you're speaking so
Mm.
much, it's
Yeah,
actually
yeah,
very, very tiring.
yeah, it can be. Yeah. But I'll go back to the UK and I'll go back into the garden and be quiet for a while and listen to
Yeah,
audiobooks,
you'll
which is
need
what I
that.
do. Mm.
And did you, while you were researching for this exhibition and putting it together, was there anything particularly interesting that you had come across which you found surprising, perhaps? Did you translate that into your work, and or is there a piece that you feel that really was almost accidental the way that it came about? If you could talk a little bit about that.
To some extent, there were.
Yeah.
There are two bodies of work there that are about Eurasia, and they're both based on these 18th century wild rose engravings of 3 rose species. And so one series is called Rosa subrosa, and then the subspecies of the rose. So it's Gallica and Pimpina and Rudutier. And the other one is called Dark Rosa, again, the subspecies. And so one is these very high-end archival prints, which I've removed with a scalpel. So they become these sort of white ghosts. They become these white ghosts of the plant. And when I went into that work, I didn't know. I knew I wanted to intervene on the rose prints. And I know I wanted to speak about what I see as the degradation of the garden, which we all live in. Whether you call it the global forest, whether you call it Gaia, or whether you call it Eden. I believe we all live in the garden. We just don't, we don't acknowledge that we live in the garden and we need to look
Mm-hmm.
after it. And that's the sort of premise of my position. So I didn't know how that was going to turn out. And I also simultaneously started to do these rose embroideries where I'm blackening the rose with black thread, which, partly is a reflection of the interventions I do on the paradise carpets, of which the Carlos mapping is one.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't know how far that was going to go, and that turned into a completely black silhouette. But in both cases, they're
Yeah.
sculptures. In both cases, they're sculptures of sorts. But they also speak about, a darkening of the garden. And I think of that both cyclically in terms of what happens in the northern hemisphere to garden plants, what
Hmm.
happens to the garden. But I also think of it, in terms of what we're doing to the this incredible world we live in, and
Very
hopefully,
relevant for what's happening right now.
so that's really what those works are about. And it is always a surprise making work because you go in with certain intentions, and it's very rarely the work actually manifests itself in accordance with that.
I do think that I felt this on many of the conversations that I've had. A lot of the bodies of work that artists have worked upon have been strangely and almost scarily, what is the word for it, foretelling. What artists work upon often, it seems to be so much ahead of its time. And I feel that this show that you were working upon, you must have started it far before COVID ever happened. And lo and behold, you were so correct to bring this attention and this focus on the earth and ecology and the garden in particular, which has become
Yeah.
something that we now desperately all want around us.
Yeah, I mean, I think, with something like COVID, you can also reflect on it as being a product of climate change and, of anthropogenic activity, and of the way we, our husbandry with animals or, all of the things we get wrong in our contemporary lives and our relationship with the biosphere. So in that case, in that sense, yes, I agree. Um, But also, in terms of my life during the COVID epidemic, pandemic, it is largely unchanged. And I think for a lot of artists, that's true. Our individual
Yeah,
practices, whether, working in the garden and working in the studio, have not been banned activities.
that's true.
But at the same time, you look at the world falling apart all around you, and I think for the West, it's been an enormous shock to find themselves in that kind of situation. In a way, living in Pakistan, it's not that we've been through pandemics, but we've been through, dengue and malaria and power outages and water scarcity and, you name
Hmm.
it. Life is not the kind of
We're very
homely.
adaptable because we have to be.
Exactly. I mean, look at the rains this year in Karachi. I
Yeah,
mean, the devastation of that. But yeah.
that's very true. We've
Yeah,
perhaps been
so
preparing.
one of the things that came up with the Carless mapping was the enormous emphasis in 1838 on the mangroves, which are absolutely
Mm,
colossal. But also other things, realization that islands which exist on that map don't exist now because they're basically infilled along with the rest of the fence.
mhm.
And the emphasis on the depth of seawater on that map is enormously topical as we look at sea level rising along this coastline.
How fascinating.
Thank you.
Are there any, no, really, it's so important to highlight these sort of scary subjects and things that we'd rather not even think about and just ignore in the
Yeah, but
ways that we have
increasing,
been doing over the last so many years.
exactly.
This
Yeah, and
constant need for
increasingly,
development and building.
yeah. I mean, I think increasingly we won't be able to ignore, and we
No.
can't. But at the same time, it's a terrible thing to live with this, and this kind of global environmental guilt that we all wear. And it's, even as a child growing up in the 70s, we are very aware of, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, for instance. It wasn't that, the canaries in the coal mine weren't crying back then. Of course they were,
Mm.
you know.
But
But
now we really
now,
have to deal with it.
mm, mm. And I think it would help if we thought of ourselves as living in the garden.
That's a beautiful way of putting it.
Mm,
But
mm.
now, before we open it up to questions, so everybody who has a burning question, please start typing them in. I wanted to ask if there was something that you were itching or desperate to do, and maybe another project, maybe a form of research, maybe planting a forest somewhere. Is there something like that that you just have not done yet and yet you really, really
Yeah,
want to? And when will you get down to it?
I don't know, but I think, the thing that I really need to do is to make a garden, but to make a garden as art. So,
Yeah, I
immediately
think you should.
immediately one thinks of, Ian Hamilton Finley's Little Sparta in Scotland, or you think of Derek Jarman's Garden in Dungeness, or you think of Brancusi's intervention at Targajui, that amazing metaphysical, you know, intervention he did into the landscape there. So, there is a context, and I also think of, for me, the garden is not a contemporary amenity space. It's a deeply metaphysical, spiritual, allegorical space. And in history, gardens have been so. And now we just think of it as, a skateboard park or some trees and a dog kind of
Yeah,
a dog walking area. But I mean, the garden is the sort of ultimate manifestation of our relationship to the natural world. And I do need to make a garden as art. But then the question is,
well,
where is
where
this
would you
garden?
make it
That's
exactly?
the
Where are
thing.
you going to do
Yeah,
it?
yeah. So where would it be, and how would it be, and who's going to look after it? Because to be, I forget who said it, but to dwell is to garden. And if you make a garden and you don't look after it, it is no longer a garden.
No, that's a shame
And
then. Yeah,
yeah,
it has to be a
and
living, breathing.
yeah, like many things. I mean, schools are the same way, I think, and many things are. We can apply that too. But no, so if you consider all of these things, I think it's better off that I don't make a garden, and that what I do is I work with garden carpets. The Kashans and the Kamans in particular that have these strong, depictions of the Charbagh and Paradise and Jannat and
Well,
Eden. And
yes,
and what I do
but
is I take these carpets at the end of their lives, and I work with them as a, and they're already palimpsests of their lived history, on top of the fact that
that's
the
true.
text of the Kashan is so strong and is such a strong cultural signifier. That's the way, I like to quote that kind of cultural signifier for my interventions upon them. But it's also a way of giving them an extended life.
A new life, yes.
So I think of them as gardens that I'm looking after to some extent.
I have a question regarding the carpets. So you procure them. What is it about the carpet that first catches your attention?
Yeah, well,
And
this is the
sort of,
thing. Yeah.
yeah.
Everyone says to me, why don't you make the small carpet work? And I say to them, well, why don't you bring me your bath mat and I'll see if I can do something. But the problem is I have to have that relationship to the carpet. And although I love small carpets, I don't have that physical relationship to it. I mean, for me,
No, you look at
the
the very
small
large scale
carpet,
ones.
yeah, it's not an immersive experience. There isn't an
No.
experience of walking around the garden, if you like, when I walk
Hmm.
around a large carpet. And I have to have that strong connection to the carpet before I can do things to it. And I'm not interested in making carpets. I'm interested in
No.
creating carpets in a way.
And is there a
So
particular sort of story, or is there particular imagery that attracts you to these very large scale carpets
yeah,
when you begin intervening?
yeah, they're garden carpets. They have strong
They always
depictions
have to be.
of the garden. Yeah, and I like the Klashans in particular because they have this strong, very strong depiction of the Charbagh at their center. I mean, it's a
Hmm.
stylized medallion. Um, the work that I'm doing in the Bristol studio at the moment, I'm calling it Dark Ardeville. I have this horrible Wilton machine copy of the Ardeville carpet from the V&A, which they mostly keep in the dark. And I'm intervening on that, and I'm erasing it in black wool. So that's a kind of again a precursor to the work that I'm looking to doing in the next 2 years, which is to gently and systematically erase a whole garden carpet in black wool. So it will become a kind of black relief on black. That's what I'm intending. But again, as I say, you don't know where a work is going to end up and how it's going to go. But
Yeah.
that's where I'm starting with that.
But that sounds like quite the adventure, actually, transforming this carpet like that. Do you
I
have the
slow it.
carpet in mind yet or not yet?
I'm actually purchasing a couple of carpets these
Ah,
days,
okay. Test them
and
out.
and I'm preparing them and washing them and tumbling them and shaping them and dressing them and thinking about them. But yeah, I mean, hopefully that's almost in hand.
How interesting. I'm just seeing that nobody has asked a question yet, which is, and I'm feeling bad about hogging all your time. Does nobody else have a question for David? Please do go ahead if there's anything burning that you'd like to ask him about either the Kashan carpets or his project. Oh, there we go. Hello. Do you plan on moving back and teaching here again? Asks Amra.
It's a tough one. In many ways,
Yeah.
I would love to, but in many ways, I'd like to keep my foothold in the UK. And I'm thinking that I want to make work in Pakistan. I want to garden in the UK, maybe garden in Pakistan too.
You
I
might as
want to
well do
research.
both, go back and forth.
Yeah, I want to research in both places, and I don't know. Like life doesn't have enough months in the year to juggle all these things. I also have a child in school in the UK, so
Well, maybe
but my yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say you can spend your summers in the UK and spend your winters and whatever in Pakistan teaching there. Because
Yeah, it
according
sounds
to
like
Amra, you are one of the best teachers that she had.
mm,
So
well, that's a lovely thing
that's
to
quite the
hear.
compliment.
Thank you so much. I would be like a migratory bird moving
That's
around the
probably
world.
why they do it, to make sure that they get the best of everything,
It's a
right?
thought. I mean, let's see. Let's see. I'm definitely, really inspired about being here at this moment. But of course, a lot of my Pakistani friends are saying, well, let's see, be equally inspired in, June or September.
Yeah, that's true. Oh, Nurjahan's asking a question. Wait, hang on. Thank you, Nurjahan. If there was
Yeah, I can
If
see
there was
one
a
there.
garden space to design, would you spend that time here developing the garden? Ah, well, maybe
Yeah, yeah.
Nurjahan has a garden for
I
you.
would, well, I would absolutely do it. But, if it was financially viable to do, of course I would do it. I mean, I'm somebody who also needs to earn money and, look after my responsibilities in both places, actually. So
And
if
also
it
spread the
was,
love of the garden.
yeah, and if it was possible, I would love to do it. Yeah,
That sounds great.
absolutely.
We have a question regarding the cleaning and oh. Could you explain the cleaning and
Yeah,
shaving of the carpet
yeah.
as part of the
Yeah.
preparation? So this is more
Yeah,
pertaining to
yeah.
the
Well,
Kashan carpets.
yeah. So there is a whole sort of cottage industry in Karachi as there is in Lahore, where where carpets are washed and special floors are prepared, which you then put the carpet on, you soak it, and you put in sodas, and you use rubber scrapers on this flat cement floor, so you don't damage the carpet. And then they're dried and stretched on frames, which actually correct any distortions in them. But they're also tumbled in huge machines, which removes all the fluff, and that happens after they're sheared. And they're often sheared. You don't really bring out the colors until the carpets are sheared. And for my purposes, I shear them much closer because I take worn carpets. So part of them are worn down almost to the weft and the weave, and some of them are quite long. They haven't been shaped. And if I were to embroider into the long pile areas, my embroidery would disappear. It would literally just disappear into the pile of the carpet. So,
That
that's
has
part
to
that,
be properly
that
prepared.
that's part of it. And I'm interested in worn carpets. I'm not interested in brand new or precious, enormously precious carpets. So
How
that
old are
that's
the carpets that you generally procure?
Yeah, I
And
think
um,
I'm told that the first one I worked on, which was Garden Palimpsest, and it was a command carpet, and it was worn down to the weft and weave, so much so that it was like a kind of Turin shroud of a carpet. And And I'm told by an expert in California that looking at the back of that it's probably 150 years old. But generally, and that carpet's gone to a collection in the Middle East. But generally, the carpets I work on are not terribly old. They're not much more than the sort of early 70s, maybe a bit more than that. But it's not really about them being antique as such.
We have another more technical question regarding your working on the carpets. So bear with me. They're asking, how do you work on them? Vertically or laying flat on the ground or perhaps on a giant frame?
Well, the thing is, they're too big to put on a frame. You wouldn't be able to reach into the
Okay.
center. So they are on frames of a kind, but they're rolled up. They're rolled up on both sides so that you can sit at them. And there is just a small exposed area of around 50 centimeters or so. And your hand has to get to both sides of the carpet to handle the needle. It has to go through the carpet and then it has to come back up from the other side. So what happens is you're working on a very limited area and you keep changing the roll of the carpet. And then after a while, you put it out on the ground and have a look at it and you realize perhaps something is wrong and you unpick it and do it again. And so that's another amazing thing. For a sculptor, that's an amazing thing that, the carpet in a way is a matrix which hosts my intervention. It's like this sort of, it's like this almost, metaphysical presence, this sort of unchanged carpet with which my embroidery goes through, but the carpet is not really changed by it. It just hosts it. It can all be taken off again. And frequently it is taken off in the making of it and redone. I have a carpet in my studio that I've been working on from 2015, and I'm still fiddling around with it and adding trees to it and taking trees off it.
So they're very much like your own. They're very much like your own diaries or a testament to your daily activities and thoughts.
Yeah. No, it's true. And also, it's a bit like a garden, that you're
Very
constantly
much so.
grooming, doing things to.
Yeah, the
But
garden of your imagination, perhaps, or dreams.
yeah, completely. And when I'm putting a needle through a carpet, I find another thing. I find areas and bands of enormous density and areas of looseness. And that's down to the original weaver, how they have packed it down on the frame. So I like to think that, some of it's done in the morning, some of it's done after lunch, some of it's done when they're sleepy in the afternoon. And you can pick up like this emotional pattern that is woven, actually physically woven into the carpet in some way, which is a kind of
I find that
another
so
layer.
fascinating that you're reading the sort of the untold process of the original weavers. Someone is asking why carpets. Would you like to deal with that?
Yeah, I would. I never intended to work on carpets. But what happened was I made a proposal for the Sharjah production budget many years ago. This was around 12, maybe 15 years ago. And what I wanted to do was I wanted to create part of the estate of Versailles in the desert in Sharjah with solar lights, so that at night you could fly over the desert and you'd see this mirage of the estate of Versailles. You'd see something of the parterres of Versailles in the desert. And this was a work that was thinking about the franchising of the Louvre's collection to Abu Dhabi in this case. But it was musing about these things. It didn't happen. I did a lot of work on that project. I worked with suppliers in China for the lights, and particularly the stakes, which would set the lights at the same height over a large area. And I thought we could have a hot air balloon that could be tethered, and you could go up and you could look at it, and all kinds of things. And it didn't happen. So what happened was,
Oh no.
yeah. So what happened was, the idea moved sideways, and it moved onto a Kaman carpet I'd been dragging around in my life for many years, and it was sort of more dust and dirt than it was carpet. And I started embroidering the idea into the carpet, and I started thinking of the carpet as a placeholder for a territory that was other a territory, a way of life, a kind of cultural signifier. And that's where the work on the carpets began.
That's fascinating. Now, we have one final question before we have to go, and it's by Marjan, and she's asking, does the origin of the carpet affect your work differently? So, for example, if the Kashan carpet was found in the UK, or if it was found in Pakistan, or perhaps Iran, would the embroidery and the design and perhaps your intervention, would that then change depending on the origin?
It's an interesting idea. I can probably buy, cheaper and diverse carpets in Treptow Market in Berlin than I can in Pakistan. There's an Irani
Okay.
dealer there who has fabulous carpets.
Yeah.
And I do look around car booths in the UK, and I do occasionally buy small pieces of carpet. And, I wash them and groom them and have them around me in the studio. I haven't really worked on any of them particularly yet. And when I had more space in my homes in Lahore, I would buy carpets regularly, and I have them around the house, and I'd walk on them and think about them, and maybe I might work on them, or maybe I might return them and get something else, and that kind of activity. In the UK, I barely have the space to roll out a full-size 13-foot carpet, and so. I think potentially, I don't work on a range of carpet types. I only work on garden carpets. The word paradise, do you know where it comes from? It's quite interesting. It comes from
No, please
paradisa.
share.
Yeah, so it comes from paradisa, and paradisa is Avestan or ancient Irani for a brick wall. It means brick all about. And so that's a very interesting take on the idea of paradise. I mean, basically, it's saying paradise is about keeping things out. But if you think about the garden is always a space apart. It's not the landscape, it's the enclosure of the landscape. So gardens are always about barriers and fences and protecting a space.
And perhaps you're creating or intervening on the carpets is sort of protecting your thoughts as well. I don't know if you really want to think
Perhaps.
about it.
I mean,
Perhaps.
certainly as a child, I would play on a carpet
Yeah.
and I would feel protected by the walls of the carpet, and, they were always maps and territories for me. They were always kingdoms and gardens, When I say always, it's not like we had a lot of carpets. There was this one
But every time
particular,
that you played on them, yeah.
yeah, that one particular one. And there's a
Wow,
story
wonderful.
about that. When my parents died, that carpet was thrown in the rubbish tip. And
Oh.
and I gave an interview a while ago, and I said, and my sisters threw the carpet in the rubbish tip. And thereafter, one sister and then the other phoned me up and said, well, it wasn't me who did it. And I thought that was so funny. But in a way, if I am constantly recreating that childhood carpet, it's not such a bad thing.
It sounds quite beautiful. David, thank you so much for this. It was so wonderful to hear you speak about your show, your artistic practice, your gardening, and really what you've been working on over the last several months. Thank you for sharing all of that with us and for so patiently answering all of the questions that everybody, including myself, had. And everybody who tuned in, thank you so much for taking out the time on this Thursday evening. I appreciate it so much. I can't even tell you. But thank you very, very much.
That's been lovely. Thank you.
Thanks, David. And I hope to finally meet you properly, maybe in Karachi or in the UK, or come to
Yeah,
Islamabad while I'm here.
I,
Thank you
I
again.
might well do that. I hope to do that
Ah,
soon.
okay. Well, do keep me posted. All right. Thank you so much. All right.
Thanks.
Bye-bye, everyone.